was his view of commemorating war that the South had waged in statuary and commemorations and much more? What did he think about the legacy of it and how it should be remembered?
Well, it's very interesting. If you look, we know pretty exactly because we have letters that came to Robert E. Lee saying, will you support building a Confederate memorial or a statue to Stonewall Jackson, who had died at the Battle of Chancellorsville and was Robert E. Lee's best lieutenant, without doubt. And Robert E. Lee always has some reason for why now isn't a good time to do it. He says, if we build a statue now, it might make the victorious Federals angry. And then in another letter, he'll say, well, I don't think we can afford to build statues. The South is too poor right now. As to when the right time to build statues might be, Lee's correspondence tends to suggest he thought the answer was never. He actually gets a letter asking for his help preserving the Battle of Gettysburg. And Robert E. Lee basically responds that he thinks that the battlefield of Gettysburg should have been paved over because that countries that hide reminders of civil wars tend to move on faster from civil wars. And so in some strange way, we end up with Robert E. Lee expressing a view, if you think about this very strangely, that is in line with people today who want to tear down his monument. But before we suddenly throw Lee's view today in the camp of let's tear down Civil War memorials today, let's ask, what did Robert E. Lee want to achieve? Well, he essentially wanted to move past the Civil War and get back as closely as possible to how things were before the Civil War. He wanted to move on as fast as possible. And as I hear the arguments today, and so often the arguments are, well, let's tear down the memorials and, who put these things up? Well, the question is, what are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to just hide reminders of the fact that for a very long time in American history, Robert E. Lee was held in tremendously high regard? And you can imagine a day 20 years from now, as these statues go down in various places, where people say, we never had statues of Robert E. Lee. They were never up. And that's because we've torn them all down. I think you do end up in a situation where the landscape is significantly less interesting.
His reputation posthumous. He dies in which year again? He
died in 1870.
1870. When do the statues of him start to go up?
Well, that's a good question. And this is a point that's often given for why they should be taken down. They don't really start going up for another generation till the 1890s and then the early 20th century. This is the heyday of building Confederate memorials. It's a period of time when the lost cause narrative of the Civil War is very popular, saying that the Civil War wasn't really about slavery, it was about states' rights. And Lee is held up as an icon of this philosophy. But people tend to argue today that's peculiar, but of course it's not peculiar. This is the way almost all monument building works. We tend to build monuments a generation after a conflict because we're looking back. We're thinking about our parents who fought in the conflict, and we want to leave something.
It's the Daughters of the Confederacy and so on. Putting up statues.
Exactly. And so that's when these statues are going up. And, they do get mixed into this lost cause narrative of Robert E. Lee. It's almost a Christ-like figure who made this sacrifice for the South. And today, I think the question we face today is, do you have to take down a memorial because you no longer agree with the position of those who put the memorial up? Mm-hmm. Because if you think that, you'd have to go through our cities and face some very difficult choices. We shouldn't have to necessarily make those decisions.